Good. It's morning where I am. I saw somebody in 2:30 in the morning, so it's morning for them, but perhaps we are afternoon for some folks. Super glad to be here, to be spending this time with all of you. I see some folks I recognize from previous times we've learned together. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and I see some folks from Portland as well. And I currently live in Silver Spring in the DC area. And so I see some folks from around there as well. I lived in Pittsburgh before. I didn't know if I saw anybody there, but excited to see some faces, some familiar faces. Today we're going to dig into Parashat Vayigash, this week's portion. And so what I'd like to do is, before I sort of share my screen and we sort of dig into the text, we're going to talk a little bit about reconciliation. Right? This week's portion comes at the sort of resolution of the story when Joseph and his brothers are finally coming together. Joseph reveals who he is after his tricks that he had put his brothers through, all the hijinks that they went through. And within, I think, these texts, this story, the resolution of the story, we can draw out principles that we can use about building relationships, about reconciling with people we might disagree with or have challenged with. And I think reconciliation is a particularly powerful lesson. We see the teachers in the Gemara, the rabbis in the Gemara, talk about relationships and disagreement, and I think we are sort of in that same vein. So before I get into it, before we sort of learn the text, I'd like to invite you in the chat. Oh, thank you, Mara, for putting the source sheet in there. No spoilers. Everyone who hasn't seen it yet, we're going to get there, I promise. I'd love for people to put in the chat a one-word sort of check-in about what the word reconciliation brings out in you. Maybe that's easy, maybe that's challenging, maybe it's complicated, maybe reconciliation feels impossible. Like whatever that thing is, put in the chat what you're feeling. Healthy, together, peace and peaceful, unity, depends. I like that. That's very honest. Understanding, worthwhile, coming together, embarrassing, impossible, acceptance, forgive but not forget, forgiveness, challenging. Yeah, you need both sides. Skepticism, I love it. Multi-level, difficult, compromise, reproachment. And this is a great set of vocabulary in general. Growth, amazing, needed, mutual. So as you keep putting them in there, we can draw out some themes, I think, of partnership and difficulty and I would say discomfort, perhaps. Right, the reconciliation is not easy. It comes with the giving up of something, perhaps. Whether it's our own understanding or feelings or a sense of blaming. We're going to get into all of that stuff. So what I'm going to do to start off with is I'm going to share my screen. What I'd like to do is we're going to have a few people read for us a couple of texts. And so if you'd like to be part of that, I'm going to encourage you to use the raised hand function, which is under the reactions tab. And you can see the word raise hand. And then when it's time to read, Mara will unmute you. So I'm going to share my screen here. And if you look in the chat, you will find the link to this as well. I can see a bunch of you already on here with your anonymous animals. I'd love to get the first volunteer. Nina, why don't you, I saw your name first. Why don't you read for us just this first verse?
Sure. Then Judah went up to him and said, "Please, my lord, let your servant appeal to my lord, and do not be impatient with your servant, you who are the equal of Pharaoh."
Great. Don't go anywhere because I'm going to have you read the next section as well. This text is the very beginning of the verse. Of the chapter of the Parsha. It's not the beginning of the chapter, it's the beginning of the Parsha. And it begins, we're not going to read the whole retelling that Judah does with his brother, but Judah and his brothers have gone and come back a number of times with all sorts of challenges and struggles that Joseph had put before them. And this is the beginning, right, where he's starting to retell the story of the last time they went back and forth. Nina, why don't you read for us just one or two more sentences, and then we'll move to somebody else.
When we came back to your servant, my father, we reported my Lord's words to him. Later, our father said, go back and procure some food for us. We answered, we cannot go down. Only if our youngest brother is with us can we go down. For we may not show our faces to the man unless our youngest brother is with us.
Amazing. Why don't you pause you there, Nina? Right. So we get this whole story from Judah, and we hear about something that Joseph could not have already known. We have this section in which Judah is telling about the interactions with their father, right? That we reported Joseph's words. Go, Jacob comes, says, go and get food for us. We answered, we can't go do this. Our brother is, our brother's with us. We can't go back without Benjamin. And Robert, why don't you read the second half of the paragraph for us? Your servant, my father, said to us. Hold on a sec. Make sure we're unmuted.
Your servant, my father, said to us, as you know, my wife bore me 2 sons, but one is gone from me. And I said, alas, he was torn by a beast, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and he meets with disaster, you will send my white head down to Sheol in sorrow.
Awesome, Robert. I love the passion in your voice. Why don't you read the next one for us as well?
Therefore, please let your servant remain as a slave to my Lord instead of the boy, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father unless the boy is with me? Let me not be witness to the woe that would overtake my father.
Amazing. Thank you, Robert. So when Judah is the one who's speaking to Joseph, he's retelling this story, and he's referring to himself as your servant, and my Lord, he's referring to Joseph. So he's telling, right, our father said he's still grieving over this son who happens to be the man who's standing before them. And if you take Benjamin from me, I'm gonna die, right? I'm gonna feel terrible. This is gonna be painful. And so therefore, Judah asks Joseph, let me stick around, right? I don't want to be a witness to my father's struggle. Sheila, I'd love for you to read this next section here. So Judah is telling this story, and we come to, at the end of the telling of this story, at the beginning of chapter 45, Joseph finally has a chance to reveal himself. So Sheila, why don't you unmute here?
Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone withdraw from me. So there was no one else about when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. His sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear, and so the news reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph, as my father still well. But his brothers could not answer him, so dumbfounded were they on account of him. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come forward to me. And when they came forward, he said, I am your brother Joseph, to whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me hither. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you.
Amazing. Thank you, Sheila. So you'll notice that we're not reading every verse because it would take us a long time to read the whole, read every verse from this parsha, or at least even the first half. And so I just want us to take a moment and reflect. There is so much information in this paragraph, and we're going to break it down a little bit later. But just to review, Joseph, overwhelmed by feeling, asks everyone else to leave and makes himself known to his brothers. He says, it's me. I'm your brother. Is my father okay? And his brothers are overwhelmed. They have no idea what to do, right? It says, but his brothers could not answer him. They had no idea how to respond. And so Joseph invites them close and says, it's okay. I'm your brother. I was sold, I'm the one that you sold into Egypt, into slavery, but don't be distressed. It was all for a good reason. We'll break that down as we go along, but I want to just make sure we have an overview of the whole story. River, I see you there as well. I'd love for you to read for us here. So let's make sure you're unmuted.
And you must tell my father everything about my high station in Egypt, and all that you have seen, and bring my father here with all speed. With that he embraced his brother Benjamin around his neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. Only then were his brothers able to talk to him.
Fantastic. Keep reading. Read the rest of it.
The news reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph's brothers have come. Pharaoh and his I can't pronounce that word.
Courtiers
Were pleased. As he sent his brothers off on their way, he told them, "Do not be quarrelsome on the way." They went up from Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan.
Amazing. Thank you, River. So we have at the end, Joseph tells his brothers, "You've got to tell our father about everything that's happened." And brought him together. Everybody came together and they cried, and only then were the brothers able to share what was going on with them. And then we hear that the news reached Pharaoh's palace, which is sort of an interesting phrase. Joseph's brothers have come, and Pharaoh and his courtiers were pleased. In between, right before this section here, verses 13 through 15, right before this, Joseph promises all sorts of things. You're going to come to Goshen. We're going to give you lots of stuff. You'll have a safe place to be. And in between these two verses, 16 and 24, Pharaoh effectively promises the same thing. You'll come. We'll give you all sorts of stuff. You won't need for anything. Don't even worry about bringing a lot of things. We're going to give you cattle. And right before they head back, Joseph says to them, "Do not be quarrelsome on the way." And then they go back. There is so much information there. I know we just barely scratched the surface. And so what I want to do, and we'll share sort of at the end, I'll invite you to share your own experiences. I want to, I'm just going to share my screen again. I know it says, let's look at the text, but we're about to break it down. I want to break out a few of the principles that I see around the concept of reconciliation, which I think is such an important theme, not only in life, but in this story. And so with that, we'll get at the end and people will be able to get a chance to share about what they feel about each of these principles and the story as a whole. And so the first one I want to point out to is this idea that each of us holds a partial truth. Right? Judah is telling, this is the very beginning of the story, Judah tells Joseph the story since they had last met. Right? They had gone and come back, and Judah and his brothers are finally before Joseph again, and he tells this story. And I think it's important for us to remember that he's only telling part of the story. It's his own perspective. It's the part of the story that resonated with him. How often in our own lives do we share the part of the story that is most meaningful to us, regardless of perhaps the full data-driven part of the story? Right? I remember growing up when my brother and I would fight, we'd eventually find ourselves before our mother, and each of us are telling two halves of the same story. Each of us telling telling our mother that the other one started. Right? It wasn't that it was wrong or that isn't true, but it's a sense of understanding that we have a partial truth. And so as we think about reconciliation comes when we can recognize that each person, everyone is holding a partial truth. And that includes us. But that when we can honor that truth that is in others, when we can understand their experience, so too we can honor the truth in ourselves together. All the story is held by all of us together, and we can see this sort of reflected in this verse from Genesis 44. The second principle I want to point out is the importance of expressing our fears. Judah, in his retelling of the story, expresses many of the fears he has. He's forced to confront the mortality of his father. He has to then express to this incredibly powerful figure who's standing before him, unbeknownst to him, his brother. One of the biggest challenges we face in general in life and in reconciliation is being able to fully express our fears. Because it's not surprising, we don't want to do that. It's scary. And yet, expressing those fears are incredibly liberating. One of my favorite writers, Tim Ferriss, talks about this question we all ask: what's the worst that could happen? And it's a question we all ask of ourselves, especially throughout a variety of circumstances. But what he points out is the importance of asking the second question that we don't ask, which is, how likely is that thing? How likely is the thing that we are afraid of? Now, it isn't to say that it's impossible, that it's unlikely, but it's the recognition of understanding what our fears are and how likely those fears to come into fruition. And I think that when we think about reconciliation, reconciliation comes when we can express our fears, when we can be honest about them and scrutinize them about how likely that fear is to come to pass. The third principle I want to point out is the power of privacy. Right? Not everybody has permission to our emotional expression. Right? Joseph sent out the attendants. He wanted to create this intimate space for him and his brothers, a chance to shed the pomp and circumstance that he carries every single day. It's a reminder that we don't owe anyone else our emotions. And we don't have to feel like we have to put them on display. Being able to control our environment really does matter. It's a powerful thing in our life. And I think what we can learn here is that reconciliation comes when we can create the context that allows us to be ourselves, to create a safe space for ourselves, and to be able to share what is happening in that safe place. And we can see that here in the Torah itself, right, where he has everybody leave before he can share the truth with his brothers. One of the most challenging, I think, moments, and I think in our society, especially as a white heterosexual male, is expressing our emotions. And especially in a person in power like Joseph, it's only in this moment of intimacy of after years that he's able to express fully the emotions of his journey. He can show the pain, his relief, all of the things that are being held that he's unable to express until this moment. And we can hear that his sobs are so loud that everyone could hear it. Now, whether or not that's literally true, notwithstanding, it's this power, this idea that it was so robust of an expression. And now this word, the translation uses the word sobs, which it sort of gives us a sense of a thorough expression of emotion, which isn't quite in the text, but we learn it from the context, right? That everyone could hear. He's just letting it all out. And it's not just him being sold into slavery, but the whole journey, right? Including the last few chapters of his brotherly interactions. And I think what we can learn about from this is that reconciliation comes when we have a chance to really fully express ourselves and let out all that we've been holding in. And I think that leads us to this next piece, which is the seeking of validation. Joseph asks, he says, I am Joseph, is my father still well? But it's really strange because Judah had just told the story describing his father. Shouldn't he already know the answer to the question? Because he's not asking merely for the answer. He's asking so that people can hear that he's asking. He's seeking validation. He wants to know. He knows intellectually, but he doesn't necessarily have let it sunk in emotionally, right? That he is really revealing himself, that his father is okay, the person that he has missed for so long. And he wants his brothers to know that he still cares, that he's spent time thinking about them and his father. And I think this is a reminder, especially with the ability to share of ourselves, this important power to be heard, to know. The question is not really, is my father still well? Are you hearing my caring? Are you hearing everything I'm bringing to the table at this moment? And I think part of reconciliation comes when we have a chance to express our feelings and have our experiences validated. And again, this links us back to the very first point, which is that we all hold a partial truth. That reconciliation comes when we recognize and are validated in that truth that we hold. Now, one of the things I've learned in the last number of years, and I think particularly during the pandemic, is the power of being proximate. Now, for those of you who may not familiar with that term or that phrasing, it's that we gain a particular level of understanding when we are physically close to someone, that when we can really walk in their shoes. Now, we've all experienced the opposite of this in the pandemic, which is that we know how hard it is to not understand someone when we're far away, right? That we're all trapped in our houses on some level. But here we see when he invites his brothers close, that reconciliation comes, at least in part, with when we can embrace physically or metaphorically, just getting a real understanding of what the other person is feeling, of getting intimacy and closeness, right? Joseph said to his brothers, "Come forward to me, come close to me." And they did so. They came close. We talk about the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And I think it's important that this journey, which I think many of us have experienced, is challenging, and we know it doesn't always happen in this order. And in my own journey of grief and a variety of different experiences I've had, I was talking to my therapist, and he recommended a book written by David Kessler, who has worked with, whose name escapes me now, the person who developed the 5 stages of grief. And in his book, he talks about the 6th stage that we don't often talk about, which is finding meaning, and that's the name of his book. And here's what I think we see in Joseph. Don't be distressed, don't reproach yourselves because you sold me. I have found meaning in that I was here to save a life. And he spends a number of verses right after this explaining what this journey has meant to him. Now, I think it's a good reminder for all of us that it isn't to say that everything in our lives feels this way, or that, God has a plan and that is a satisfying answer. For many of us, it isn't. But I think part of reconciliation can lead us to, not always, but can lead us to helping us create the context, the stage, the space in order to find this 6th stage in grief, the 6th step, which is finding meaning. Now, we're at the last few principles here, and then I'm going to open it up for discussion. I generally like to discuss things as we go, but I wanted to make sure to share each of these pieces, which is one of the things we have to do when we build in reconciliation. Again, these are all the principles we're deriving from the story, is that we have to allow space for the other people. Like reconciliation, as so many of you said, requires 2 people. It's not enough for me just to share my own feelings, but to create space for the others. And we see this in the text itself. The Torah says, right, that they weren't able to respond because of their overwhelm of their feelings, right, until they were able, there was this sort of accumulation moment, right, that Joseph pauses, gives him, they emote together, and only then were his brothers able to talk to him. They needed time to let it sink in. They needed time to process all that was happening. We've gone verses and verses without them having a chance to even say anything. I think what we can imagine is how they were feeling in this moment, right? We don't actually hear what they say. The Torah doesn't tell us that. But I can imagine the feelings and frustrations, the joy, the sorrow, the complexity that they're feeling, relief, anger, all the things they are feeling as they have been tricked for who knows how long by their brother, after they themselves did something. I can imagine how challenging this moment is, but a chance for them to come together, to create space for one another to express what they were feeling. Finally, after Pharaoh, and they come before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh gives them all sorts of permission, Joseph reminds them on their way not to be quarrelsome. We might ask ourselves, why does he say this? What is this telling? What is this telling us and telling the brothers? Now, Rashi tells us that Joseph says this so that the brothers won't spend the time on the road back arguing with each other about who was at fault for the scenario that they're in. Well, you were the one who told us about the coat and the dreams. Well, you were the one who made us angry, and you're the one who convinced us to dig the pit, and you're the one who negotiated. Whatever that is, Rashi and Joseph are telling us it's not worth it. This is not how you should be spending your time. And I think, again, these are not like hard and fast rules or even a how-to guide, but principles to keep in mind. That reconciliation comes when we can move away from blame and towards rebuilding. It isn't to say that people aren't at fault or that there isn't a responsibility. I think that it is, that those things exist. But that at a certain stage of the game, you have to shift towards rebuilding. Now, I've talked a lot so far, and I think for me, you can see all of them written out here together. These are the things I see about reconciliation. Relationships are so hard. They are so hard. There are so many dynamics that come, baggage, power dynamics, all types of relationships. But if we are in the space, the mental space, the emotional space, to try and find a pathway forward, I think pulling from these principles gives us something to build on. Now, we find at the beginning of the story that it says in the text, I'm going to switch my slides here back to the text for a second. You can see here that, maybe I skipped it here. I skipped it on the first one, but it says that, oh no, it's the line with the sobbing, right? His sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear, so that the news reached Pharaoh's palace. And at the end, we found out that the news had reached Pharaoh's palace. And one of the questions we ask is, why are we getting this repetition? And I think one of the primary reasons for that is, I wrote it down and I lost my notes here for a sec. It shows up at the beginning of the story with the sobs and at the end. And one of the reasons, what we can pull from this is what Rashi says is that the word being used is bayit. It's not just palace, but bayit. And that ultimately, to have a house, where we talk about shalom bayit, a house full of peace, it happens when we can come together, to be in conversation, to try and rebuild the relationships. Because in the end, I just officiated a wedding on Sunday, and what I said to them is that in the end of the day, relationships are all we have. And that's what we should spend our time focusing on. Okay, I'm going to stop talking for a moment, and I see a number of folks who's raised their hands. So I'm going to just lower the hands of the people who read, and then if you have something you want to say, you can raise your hand again. Dr. Ginny, hopefully I've said your name correctly. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
I think the whole idea of reconciliation here is something that has become so complicated because of the issues of the time spent of Joseph during the past and what happened to the brothers during that time. And I think that's an important part to look at. We know what happened to Joseph, but what happened to the brothers during the time that had passed by?
Right. We have a sense, sort of a hint of what their experience is like, but we spent most of our time focusing on Joseph, and learning their story is such an important part of it. Thank you so much. Susan.
I just want to comment on your concluding issue, which is how is it possible to rebuild without a strong foundation? And what constitutes a strong foundation? Some people like me might say you need to hash out all the problems rather than just sweep them under the carpet. Otherwise, your rebuilding is just going to be a failure. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, look, every relationship is different, so I want to sort of name that. I'm not prescribing for every relationship. But I do think that we talk about tshuva, which is related a related subject, not quite the same as reconciliation, but similar, that does require responsibility taken. And I think I can imagine when we don't hear what the brothers say, but I can imagine them saying, "We're sorry that we've found ourselves in this situation." It doesn't say it, but that's what I imagine is happening. And so that when when he is recommending not to blame themselves, it's because all of that has already happened. Now, again, that's me reading into it. It's not necessarily a satisfying answer, but I do think for tshuva to happen, some sense of responsibility on one side, and also, as my therapist has certainly said to me, at a certain point, you also have to let go, and you decide whether or not it's worth to move forward. And if it is, you have to create space for that too. One person's opinion, but I hear where you're coming from, certainly. Josh.
So I've always been troubled by the fact that Joseph's first reaction is, "How is my father?" Not our father, but my father. And that to me kind of muddies the water here. But what I'm thinking now is that maybe the idea of reconciliation isn't necessarily about coming to a strong sense of who did what to whom and why, but it's the first step is the acknowledgement, like you're saying, the acknowledgement that there is something there that needs to be worked on. There, Jacob and Esau reconcile in a way also, and they also weep on each other's necks, but then they separate and they never talk again. Maybe the reconciliation here is that the brothers can acknowledge that we got a lot to work on. We got time to work on it. We don't have to settle everything now. I mean, it's all reading into it. But anyway, my point is that I've always been troubled by the fact that Joseph's first reaction is my father, not our father.
Yeah, I think we can pull a lot of lessons from that, right? That sense of perhaps Joseph feeling that it hasn't been his father for so, right? That he has had such he had such distance that maybe he never allowed himself to talk about his own father. Again, I'm reading into it also, but I love that imagery, right? That we actually don't have to resolve every problem right now. We can put the first brick down, right? I guess using Egypt as a metaphor is probably not the strongest here, but right, that this is just the first step towards reconciliation. I think that's really powerful. And I also just want to draw out Barry, who put in the chat, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote the book about the 5 stages of grief. I'm glad we were able to pull her name out. I couldn't remember it in the moment, but glad we could have it here. Lois. Oh, let's make sure you're unmuted.
Hi, I belong to a support group for parents who have lost children. And we talk about David Kessler's book a lot. And in our meetings, we talk about forgiveness and reconciliation, because forgiveness more benefits us than the people who caused the problems, because it gives us some peace and we can go on with our life instead of always being angry. And when you've lost a child, you're angry at God, you're angry at yourself, you're angry at so many people. And that keeps you, to us, it keeps you as a victim. So at some point, when you go through the pain of the loss, you get to a place where you can reconcile your feelings and have some forgiveness. It does take time. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much, Lois, and thank you for sharing just even a sliver of your own story. Right, that in a lot of ways, forgiveness and reconciliation is a gift we can give ourselves. Right, thank you for that. Warren and/or Phyllis.
I think it's interesting that Joseph doesn't get in touch with his family or send spies to see what's going on with them. And I think it might be an indication of the difficulty, as you mentioned, and the pain that was caused. And it could have been that it was too painful for him to do that.
Yeah, Yeah, I saw somebody put in the chat, they were separated for 22 years. Stephen said that. That's a long time to hold pain. And sometimes it's hard when you hold it for that long. It doesn't, it feels more painful. And that distance. Thank you for adding that. Really appreciate it. Carol.
I have trouble accepting Joseph's statement that he's just fine with this. God meant it. He put his brothers through a process that I think really would make reconciliation very difficult. I mean, travel wasn't so easy. They didn't just hop on a train and go to see dad and come back an hour later. And he terrified them, and somebody was in jail, which could not have been particularly pleasant. He scared the wits out of his father, who was should at least in his eyes be an innocent party to this. I think what he did was horrific. And I don't understand how this helps reconciliation. It should prevent it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In the sense that Joseph didn't do the right thing, I think, through all of this. I mean, if we look at it in the way that you did, right? He put them through the ringer, right? He made it worse for them. He made them suffer, perhaps, through that experience. I think for me, if I were to take meaning out of it, it's a recognition that both him and his brothers did wrong by each other. They harmed one another. And we don't always see that, right? Judah is telling his own part of the story. We're hearing Joseph's part of the story. But as human beings, we don't have an omniscient narrator. We don't have the narrator to tell us what everybody else is thinking. And
they also harmed their father. Both of them harmed their father terribly. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a discomfort we can hold, right? That they didn't all do the right thing. I'm really glad you mentioned it. Thank you, Carol. Julie.
I think it's interesting that his brother would say, no, don't take him. Let me be your slave instead. And he was probably thinking something along the lines of, when I get back to my father and tell him, he's not going to be too pleased with me.
Right. He's protecting his brother, but himself putting himself into danger, which ostensibly his father doesn't want him to do either. Great. I'm glad. Thank you for adding that. Aaron and Stephen, and then we'll sort of call it a morning.
I think the one thing that hasn't been touched on as much during this that feels important is guilt. Everyone in this situation feels guilty. The 10 brothers who sold their brother into slavery are now being faced with him in a position of power, having enacted revenge, essentially, and saying, well, I'm your brother, and I'm claiming our father as mine, because it feels like a power move to be like, this is my father. And then for Joseph to be like, realizing now that he's at this emotional point, okay, so I put my siblings through all of this pain, and hearing that his father is going through this pain and talking about how it's affecting him in terms of his health and his relationship with his sons, and how what happened to Joseph has made him overprotective of Benjamin. Everybody is experiencing guilt in this, and I think that it is definitely impacting their decisions and what they're carrying out in this entire parsha.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Right. I think like Carol, I think Carol said before, right? Like people are not acting kindly towards one another. They're really doing pretty terrible things to one another. And the power of guilt is a big piece to this. I'm glad that you brought that up. I would even add, just to sharpen the point that you made, right? That there's a power dynamic, right? Like Joseph holds all the cards, and power is something that we can wield for good and not so good. We'll do Stephen, and then I was told in the chat that Joel and Nels were raising their hands physically. We'll end with the three of you, Stephen, Joel, and then Nels.
Okay, I think one of the people we have to keep in our memory on this is Judah. I mean, one of the key moments in this is that when Judah placed himself in prison to save the life of his half-brother, which is a repentance for when he was placed in that situation 22 years earlier, he let his half-brother be sold off. Now, instead, he repented. He's placed himself in jail. I think that is a crucial thing, and it demonstrates to Joseph that his brothers have changed. These are not the same men who sold him off 22 years ago.
Great, right. So not only do we see Judah express the story, but also he's learned from it, right? He's changed from it. He's grown from it. Perhaps he too has worked through the stages of grief and found meaning and said, I have to be different. I am different now. I have to make different choices. Great. Thank you for adding that, Stephen. Who did I say before? Joel, I think. Is he still here? We lose him? All right, we'll go to you, Nels, and if he pops up, we'll give him a chance.
Well, I thought it was interesting that what Joseph acknowledged, that what turned out as a bad thing turned out to be a good thing, because here he's now able to save his family and many others from famine. So sometimes we take a very narrow view and see that what is bad can turn out to be good. And so I think that sometimes we focus on he did this and he did that. But if you do the over picture, you can see that there's a life force, and being Jewish means we have to adapt, and that can help us succeed. That's my thought.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nels. Yeah. This story, I mean, it has so many layers to it, and we can pull out all sorts of things. Joel, I'll give you the last word here, and then we'll end on time for folks so that they can go on with their day.
I think communications is the key. I mean, I think that both the parent and the child both have a responsibility under the 10 Commandments to honor your father and mother, that you must communicate whether you're happy or not, that this is a key element of Judaism. It's a value, it's a Jewish value to communicate and honor your parents. You can't wait 17 years to do this, especially when you're vice commander, you're the second in charge of all of Egypt. You got the ability. That's my point.
Great. Thank you for adding that, Joel. And I'll just pull out, right, the power of communication through all of this, right? That finding a way to express yourself in a way that can be heard, in a way that that feels authentic, is a challenge for all of us in the best of times, but certainly a piece of this year. We're gonna end our discussion there for today. Just want to thank you all for being here. We can thank Mara for all of the work that she did today to make sure this all ran smoothly. I hope all of you have a wonderful Shabbat, and we'll see you next time. And be well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.